Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jen Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. We are recording today on February 24th, the 3-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And there are now major question marks about the future of the conflict. Unfortunately, for those of us in the United States that care about Ukraine and its future, it is the Trump administration that has become the key variable. The Trump administration began negotiations with Russian officials in Saudi Arabia last week, excluding from the table both Kyiv and its European backers. Their exclusion cast doubts on the viability of any potential settlement. President Zelensky has made clear his refusal to accept a deal forced down Ukraine's throat. Yet it's far from certain how long the Ukrainians can continue their war effort without the support of the United States. Can Europe fill the gaps? How far would Ukraine's own defense industry, and especially its drones, that now inflict a majority of casualties on Russia, be able to go in countering Russian forces? Without the U.S., what will come of Ukraine's manpower issue? Will anyone be willing to join the fight if the U.S. is no longer in the picture? To discuss the realities of Ukraine's military situation and whether Europe can fill the gap left by Washington, we're very pleased to have with us Franz-Stephan Gady and Gustav Gressel with us on the podcast today. Gustav, welcome to you both.
Nice to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Quick introductions. Franz-Stephan Gady is an adjunct senior fellow in the defense program at CNAS, and he's the founder of Gady Consulting. And Gustav Gressel is at the National Defense Academy in Vienna, and he is an expert on Russia, Eastern Europe, and defense policy. So maybe just a question to start big and broad. Let's actually, Gustav, start with you in giving us a picture of how things stand on the battlefield presently, and then we can talk through what the implications would be and changes in levels of U.S. support, et cetera, et cetera. But kind of as of today, 3 years on in the war, summarize for us what the picture looks like in Eastern Ukraine and in Kursk.
Well, so the overall picture is that Russia is still on the offensive. They enjoy the initiative. They enjoy a considerable superiority in terms of manpower. Their superiority, though, in equipment is shrinking due to heavy losses. They have to concentrate their offensives more. So we have seen they have been in the offensive for more than 1 year. Basically since autumn 2023. So it was a really hard time, or it is still a really hard time for Ukrainians to weather this storm. However, we see that the storm is getting a bit weaker. It's still a storm, but we see, of course, now the most sort of two places where there are a lot of Russian efforts. The biggest is of course Pokrovsk. That's a town in southwestern Donetsk Oblast. It's basically the southeastern corner of the Ukrainian front. Russians have gained some breakthroughs there in the spring, and they're still exploiting them. They hope to reach to break the fortress belt that is running in the west of the Donetsk Oblast. They try to basically cut off Ukrainian supply lines in the southeast and exploit the situation there. The other part is the where there is a lot of activities, or where it is sort of noticeable activities. Of course, the area of Kupiansk, which is in the very northeast, in Kharkiv Oblast, in the very east of it, and there the Russians trying to expand their bridgeheads over the Oskil River, which is a big natural barrier that made it easy for Ukraine to defend there, to thin out their forces because they needed them in the south. And the more this bridgehead expand, the more, of course, manpower issues are also getting critical for Ukraine, because they have to insert much more forces than if they would just guard a barrier. Well, and the third sort of area of skirmish is of course Kursk, an area where Ukraine started a small offensive into Russia itself. This is more a token offensive, so they try to exchange this in possible negotiations. The problem for the Ukrainian side, it still consumes resources. It consumes not a lot of forces on paper because it's a quite small area, but these forces that are fighting there are the best Ukraine can muster. And of course, they could be used elsewhere. And the problem is Ukrainians don't know how long they will hold that because everybody thought there will be quick negotiations with Donald Trump. But given the botched way the current US administration is stumbling into negotiations, if I may call it that way, make it very likely that actually this whole process, if it yields a result at all, will linger on for quite some time.
Franz, what would you add? I mean, I think you were just there. Is that right? I forget how long ago and how long you've been back, but I know you gained some valuable insights from being on the ground there. So anything you would add or say differently to what Gustav said?
Yes, I've just come back from Ukraine a couple of days ago, and I would probably add, first off, it is true that Russians' operations have slowed down while we were there. It's unclear what the specific reasons are for that. And some of it most likely has had to do with an extremely warm winter. And because of that, the Russian forces were not able really to use some of the heavy equipment, armored vehicles and so forth, to attack because the ground just never froze. That's certainly one factor. Another factor is that there was a drop in glide bomb drops in November and December, beginning of January, and then started picking up again. But this was also due to mostly bad weather. So these are two factors that most likely contributed towards the Russians, the operational pace of Russian operations slowing down. By the time we left Ukraine, it seems that operations have picked up again. It's clear that the front in southern Donetsk around Pokrovsk is not really stable, but by and large, that's the only part where the front is not, relatively stable at least. And overall morale along the front line is pretty high. Ukrainian forces are pretty motivated, and this is certainly not a military that is on the verge of collapse or imminent military defeat. The Ukrainians do have notional parity in artillery and parity, if not superiority, when it comes to strike drones along most part of the front lines, right? So that's a good development. And it also speaks to the fact that Western support is indeed working. And I think if we would have stayed the course, or we, that is the West, including the United States, would have stayed the course with continuing military supplies and deliveries of various types of ammunitions, I think the Ukrainians would have had a pretty good chance to actually inflict substantial losses on the Russian attackers, to the point where at some point perhaps the Russians over the next couple of months, perhaps not in the next before the summer, but perhaps in the fall or later at some point in early 2026 would have had to reconsider their options in terms of continuing their assaults or stopping them, because what's clear is that the Russians have suffered tremendous casualties over the last couple of months. And that certainly also played a role why the operational pace has slowed down. Having said that, the Russians certainly can replace the losses currently. They don't have a manpower shortage, and actually they're expanding their force, right? Whereas the main issue on the Ukrainian side is not really lack of ammunition at the moment, or lack of other military hardware, equipment and so forth, but it's really manpower. And I think Ukraine first and foremost still needs to fix its manpower issue, and that's a challenge. And I think that's an even bigger challenge if you have at the political strategic level discussions about perhaps calling a ceasefire or an ally, a partner of Ukraine, the United States, the most important partner and ally, abandoning perhaps Ukraine, because nobody wants to be the last person to die in a war where the best outcome for Ukraine at this stage is probably a fairly suboptimal outcome for Ukraine. That is, it probably will have to concede at least to a freezing of conflict lines along the current front line in the best case outcome. And this is obviously not a good development. So I think the situation overall is it's not catastrophic, right? But it's also not it's not going in a positive trajectory for Ukraine. But at the same time, also Russian forces are certainly not achieving operational breakthroughs at the moment. And Ukrainians have a fairly well established tactical system in place to repel Russian attacks. And as I said, overall, I think the situation is such that the Ukrainian armed forces are certainly putting up a hard fight, and that morale remains fairly high on the front line.
So, Franz, I know you were there, you got back several days ago. So I don't know, like, if you had the opportunity, like, were Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines kind of aware of the US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia? Like, did any of this kind of, I don't know, very significant shift in US posture, had that made its way to the front lines? And did you get any kind of reaction from soldiers, how they were viewing that, and whether or not that might be something that could really dim morale? I mean, as you said, morale remains high, but what do you think it means for soldiers and fighters if all of a sudden the United States really has walked away or is not in the picture to the extent that they have been over the last 3 years?
Well, it was interesting talking to officers and soldiers in different parts of Ukraine. And I think the consensus view has been, by and large, that no matter who is going to support them, they will continue to fight. Because I tried to ask a few times, well, where do you think the front line is going to be in a year from now? Or what do you think is going to happen? And most often the response was, listen, we have our specific problems here at the front line. Right now, it's about inflicting heavy casualties on the Russians, and we'll be here next year, even if we are fighting Russia solely, on our own without any Western support. Now, having said that, of course, once going back to Kiev, it was a big. There were discussions about U.S. Political moves and potential, the United States potentially abandoning Ukraine, and it certainly has had an impact, I would say, on some of the opinions of senior decision makers about how much they can rely on the United States in the future, for sure. Overall, I think the situation is seen by many in Ukraine as very critical. And there is a sense also that they're getting abandoned, not just by the United States, but also by Europe, because there's still a large sense that whatever the United States is doing, the Europeans will follow suit. And let's see whether that's really going to be true or not.
Well, thank you for both of you for being on, and let's follow up on that point about Europe. Andre and I talk about this all the time. I just swing back and forth. I guess first of all, what do both of you think about these emergency summits that were held in Paris? There were, in fact, 2 days of them, I believe. Right now, Macron is in Washington talking to Trump. Keir Starmer is going to come in. Starmer and Macron are going to talk about providing security forces, asking that the U.S. be a backstop. That's what Keir Starmer wants to talk about. And then talk about Europe has now finally gotten the big wake up call, and they're turning to their defense industry to really surge. And what do you make of that? Is it too late? Is it just really too late? Number one, and number two, just to take it at a 10,000, 20,000 foot level, if the U.S. and Russia begin to have this friendship, and suddenly the U.S. isn't looking on Russia as this aggressor. The UN Security Council resolution, the U.S. and Russia worked to dilute it. That was sent out today about the invasion, the third year anniversary of the invasion. So suddenly, I'm thinking the Europeans are going to go, well, looks like peace is breaking out between the two big superpowers, and we don't have to worry about this. What do you think? What's the thinking in European capitals? And I know that's a big question, but Gustav, what do you think?
The too late question is a very valid one, because European politicians have long been in denial that this is a long war, and they try to avoid any kind of industrial spending preparation to lead a long war, and especially they haven't prepared for wagging a long war or supporting a long war outside of the shadow of the US. And a lot of things, depending on what we are talking about, increasing defense industrial output takes years in some cases. In artillery ammunition, we got the corner, and yes, it's one of the most important things to deliver to Ukraine on a constant basis. But the problem is, apart from artillery systems and artillery ammunitions, we still have a lot of holes. Like I just say, Patriot. It's crucial. The reason why there are more Patriot batteries in Ukraine than there are SMPT batteries, which is the French, Italian, British counterpart to the whole thing, is simply, if you talk quantity and add up how many Astra 30, which is the interceptor for the European thing, and how many Patriots we can produce per year, and how can we sustain a huge air defense campaign in Ukraine, it all leads over to the Patriot. The same goes for aircraft ammunition, even old stuff for Frankenstein things. There, of course, this is extremely hard to substitute the United States. On political will, well, there is a mixture between shock and denial. So the denial is kind of, these are those politicians that, we just need to talk to Trump and reassure him the value and sort of the commercial and monetary value of the European alliance and the continuation of the war in Ukraine. And once we can talk that to him, he will understand. That's sort of Andrzej Duda is kind of the prime example of this kind of camp.
Yeah, Macron, I think that was his purpose of coming to the White House today. Like, if we can just talk to him, then we can change it.
Then there's kind of the shocked camp that sees, okay, this is crazy. And they not only sort of care for Vance's public speeches, because they said, well, it's also for domestic policies, etc. They're even more shocked by what they have witnessed over the past weeks in consultations with the US. You have different ministers or secretaries, as they're called in the US, and envoys that talk different stuff. And that if you go into a talk with one of them, you can agree on something that the president then turns over and probably hasn't even heard of what you talked to the envoy. So they first and foremost have an impression that this administration is in total disarray, and that it's up to the moods of Trump. Nobody speaks up to Trump. Nobody confronts him with plans. Nobody does sort of the adults in the room job in that administration. And hence, it's kind of playing Russian roulette with 5 shots in the cylinder. It just probably will go wrong. And you need to hedge. And this is the larger camp. The problem, of course, is the options to hedge, given the lack of preparation, are unfortunately limited. And so, in fact, like Macron today tries to combine the two things, like hedge and still try to get an inch out of Washington for the quarters you just can't substitute on short term.
Franz, let's stick with the is it too late question. And obviously, Gustav was talking about, maybe Europe does a pretty good job with the artillery and ammunition, not so good on the air defense. Like, what can Europe do, in your opinion, to keep Ukraine in the fight? And how quickly could they make up what the US could stop doing? And I guess, and then then the ultimate question is, how long, to what extent, how well can Ukraine keep fighting just with European backing?
Right. I mean, these are all fairly difficult questions to answer, right? I can't obviously predict the future. And I know that we all are in one way or the other struggling with these questions. When it comes to Europe, I think the first and foremost question that Europe really has to ask itself, and unfortunately has failed over the last couple of decades to ask itself, is what does Ukraine really mean to Europe's security architecture? We've never really clearly defined this since, well, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, essentially, right? We didn't do it in 2014. We didn't do it right at the outset of the full-scale invasion in 2022. And I think if we fail to answer these first order questions, it's fairly difficult to actually figure out what we are willing to risk in order to preserve Ukraine, because we don't have a clear understanding what we are actually risking here. And this is a long-winded way to answer your question. I'm not so sure it's just about industrial capacity or about military capability or lack of money. I think there's just a basic disagreement over what Ukraine really means beyond or besides the rhetoric and besides some principles of the rule-based international order that existed up until a couple of months ago, at least in a rudimentary form still. And that to me is the biggest issue. And I think Europeans haven't really answered these questions. And I think this is really a very, very big challenge, because I think the Ukrainians can hold out. I don't see an imminent defeat. I don't see a total collapse of the front line in the next couple of weeks or months. It could potentially happen, right? There's always a potential for a so-called nonlinear progression of the conflict, right? If really all support is being cut off, and if Ukraine doesn't fix its manpower issue, and if Russians are more successful at the tactical level than they usually are, then of course part of the front line could collapse. Russian forces could advance. There could be substantial Russian gains, operational breakthroughs, and so forth. I think that's unlikely at the moment, but of course you can't really rule it out. But I think the major issue I see when it comes to the Europeans is that we just don't know what we're willing to risk, because we don't know how important Ukraine really is to us. So any discussion about potential peacekeeping forces, a deterrent force, and so forth, I think it's going to be difficult if we don't answer these first order questions.
So we've been talking about I agree with what both of you all have said, and but we're talking about the European nations coming together and saying we got to really surge. We've got to supply Ukraine with the military equipment they need. The U.S. is stepping back. We've got to really pump that up. But there's really a broader thing than just Ukraine and decisions about how important Ukraine is. It's also Europe trying to say, well, no, we need to be surging because the U.S. might be pulling a good number of its forces out. The U.S. Might be leaving NATO in June because of how the U.S. and Russia are working together. And we're going to be stuck with a Russian military that is, as you were saying earlier, it's getting bigger, battle experienced, drone experienced. And we're going to be faced with an emboldened Putin with a large military who is still set not just on Ukraine, but on trying to recover what was the former Soviet Union. At least that's what the Balts would say. It's what Poland would say. So I guess the following question is, if there's a feeling of, well, Ukraine's not so important to us, so we're not going to surge. There is this bigger issue, and how much is that occupying the minds of NATO capitals? Is like, look, it's not Ukraine we're surging. It's in Russia 5 years from now, 3 years from now. We've got to be able to handle them because we can't trust that the U.S. will be there for us. Is that what's being thought about in European capitals?
And just to maybe layer onto that, so if the US is going to lift sanctions, so they have greater capacity to build back faster, and we're talking about rolling back US forces to the 1990 line, so more capacity and space to pursue aggressive actions beyond Ukraine. I mean, I think that's in large part what European leaders need to be responding to. But how do you guys see it?
Well, I would say the further you walk away from Moscow, the least urgent the topic sounds. But yeah, I mean, what you describe is unfortunately the reality. Also, I mean, sort of the credibility of the US deterrent as such and sticking in NATO is also called into question by the way the US administration handles this crisis, because of course NATO Article 5, even if stay in NATO, which I think legally is very hard to leave the organization. But of course, practically, if Putin wanted to test NATO and Article 5, it's all in the president's hand to decide how to react and if to react and with what means and to what conditions. And Europeans have come by and large to the understanding that the answer from Washington in case of an attack will not be straightforward and probably will be mired in shady maneuvers, and that's horribly unpleasant. Which is of course making the whole thing worse. Well, we had elections in Germany, so it's still sitting despite working in Vienna. My family still lives in Berlin, so I'm standing sort of in between the two capitals. And basically, one of the big shifts, of course, in these elections going to Merz is that he actually gets that rationale. It's also in the Bundeswehr that sort of the higher echelons and Defense Minister Pistorius, if he stays on, he was exactly advocating this. Is like, look, guys, right now we are in peacetime war. That's why he talked with we need to get ready to wage war. Kriegstüchtig is the German word. You know, an army that is not just on paper there, but is actually capable of fighting, which most of European armies aren't. They're in deep peacetime mode. They don't have ammunition depth, and they saw, of course, how mobilizing to full-scale war in Ukraine that took time, that took effort, etc. They have to do that under the conditions of sort of normal electoral work, where you have to sell that to your constituencies. So the urgency argument actually has much been more reinforced, because all the intelligence reports Russia could attack us in 8 years, in 4 years, etc. They're now basically being downgraded because they rested on three assumptions. First, that if Russia wins in Ukraine, that victory will be a very bloody one that will exhaust Russia to basically the extinction of its armed forces. But that may be assisted by the Trump administration in making the victory cheaper. The second thing is, of course, the second assumption is that the Russian defense industry has a hard time really producing new stuff. So once they run out of Soviet legacy equipment, they will need a long time to really replenish that. That might be aided by the Trump administration by lifting sanctions and secondary sanctions, which would lift Chinese concerns to support them at a greater pace. So reconstruction might be much faster. And the third pillar is, it was always sort of these scenarios were conceived with an eye on the Pacific. When will the PLA have parity with the US? Qualitative, quantitative. When will the big Pacific war that will distract US forces and make them pull out of Europe be a reality? But now Trump, without a war in the Pacific, might just pull out. So all these assumptions, all these scenarios are basically thrown off the playing board. And if you play now in worst case scenarios how this might happen, it will get rough quite fast, quite quickly. And that's now why basically they're all stunned on this.
Franz, you agree?
Yes, I mean, I just a couple of months ago published a book called The Return of War, in which I tried to make the argument that no matter who sits in the White House, at the end of the day, Europe has to be more autonomous when it comes to its defense capabilities, capacity, and readiness, just because the United States, and I did some calculations in the book, how many troops the United States and what the United States could actually bring to a European theater, considering that its prime competitor is in East Asia these days, right? And I think what we see with the Trump administration is merely accelerating structural trends that already have been in place. I do want to emphasize that. But what is different with a Trump administration in comparison to what you would see probably on the Democratic administration is that we're in a real danger of a situation where the European security architecture can be entirely reordered, or at least reordered to favor Russia, by the simple fact that Trump, or the Trump administration, striking a deal with Vladimir Putin can incentivize other European great powers to do the same, essentially, right? Because that's in effect what I think Vladimir Putin wants at the end of the day, right? He wants to essentially go back to a type of international relations based on great power politics, where he doesn't really have to talk to Brussels. He doesn't really have to talk to NATO in any way, but he has to talk to people in Berlin. He has to talk to people in Paris. He has to, he can talk to people in London and strike a deal over the heads of smaller European states, thereby exercising Russia's traditional spheres of influence, right? Establishing a cordon sanitaire, so to speak, which has been traditionally Russian, foreign policy, and that's the real danger. So I think a lot will hinge upon the German government first and foremost, as the biggest economy, the biggest, latently at least, the biggest, the most important, the biggest military, potentially the biggest military power in Europe, and I think a lot will depend on how the Germans will react. And I don't get a sense that there is any sense of urgency in Germany. There's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of discussion. I know there's an increase in defense spending, but the fundamentals are just missing in so many ways when you look at Germany. There is still no return of mandatory conscription, which is necessary, for example, to build up a sufficient reserve, within its armed forces. There's no real discussion about how to finance really additional capability development, expansion of the force, and also little discussion about what Germany's role is supposed to be beyond a couple of talking points. And I think that's very interesting. A couple of months ago, I had a meeting with a number of European ambassadors in a Baltic country, and I did a short briefing on various options about inserting European forces into Ukraine and what individual European countries could do or not do. And then at the end of the briefing, without really engaging with what I had to say, a German ambassador, a German diplomat stood up and said, listen, I think it should be clear to all of us that we can't do anything militarily without the United States. And that's the type of mindset that's there. And I think it's almost like a self-deterring effect to actually having to make some hard choices when it comes to security policy, when it comes to defense issues without American involvement. And that, to me, is the most dangerous aspect of all of it. It's not the Trump administration. I think that was always sort of predictable that Trump would do something like that. It's just that that it came to such a surprise, or that we don't have the policy process in place. The European Union has a policy process in place and a very clear response to tariffs, to trade, economic policies, and all that stuff, right? But we still fail to develop a good coherent policy when it comes to defense issues for obvious reasons, right? Some of it is really not a bug but a feature if you look at it, right? Because the United States obviously always also had a play in all of this to make European military capabilities weaker than they should be, or more dependent on the United States. This has only started to change a little over the last couple of years, right? But it's part of U.S. Defense policy and foreign policy in general, also to carve out a role for United States defense industry, industrial complex, and many of these things. To buy more military hardware, to be a little bit more dependent on the United States. And I think this is changing, or has changed at least under the last administration. but still, even if there was a somewhat antagonistic policy to a more independent Europe, or if it was too dominated for some European countries by France, for example, I'm a bit concerned that we are where we are at the moment with all of this.
Yeah. Just to pick up on whether Europe could have a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, there's the obvious caveat that right after the Saudi talks, Lavrov was out saying that Russia won't accept any troops from a NATO member state, which to me was, a clear sign that they don't have any interest in making concessions as any part of this negotiation. But even if we set the Russian piece of it aside, Franz, just to stay with you for 1 second, because I know this is something that you've looked at deeply, is could the Europeans do it without a US backstop? Could they go in and be responsible for maintaining stability along the front line? Or is it really contingent on the US backstop? As Jim mentioned, Starmer was going to be in the US, I think, requesting that the United States play at least some role. But kind of walk us through how you see that working and whether Europe could play that role.
Well, I think there are a couple of different models that you can look at. The one that I looked at was essentially a two-tier model where you don't have European forces at the front line monitoring the front line, but you insert essentially a UN peacekeeping force consisting of mostly countries from the global south, or countries that are more prone to support a Russian perspective, so to speak, or more acceptable to the Russians, essentially to observe the ceasefire line. And then you have a deterrent force, a European deterrent force, not under NATO mandate, but it still could be part of a UN resolution, essentially, which you probably need if you want to have countries like Germany part of it, right? Because you need parliamentary approval for any deployment of German troops abroad, right? But I think we're talking about essentially major European countries contributing around a brigade equivalent when we look at the land forces. So I don't know, anything from 3,000 to 5,000 men, perhaps a mechanized brigade, and then times 3, right? Because you need to rotate these forces, you need to train them, pre-deployment training, and so forth. So we're talking about a force, essentially what Macron a couple of months ago has proposed already, of around 25 to 30,000. I think that is doable. The question is, first off, would you need to revise NATO regional defense plans? What other missions involve European troops? Is there a way where countries who don't send or contribute troops to Ukraine could take over some other European military missions and so forth? But I mean, the major question again goes back to the simple question: what does Ukraine really mean to us in Europe? And we haven't really answered that. And as long as we don't have a clear understanding, I don't think it's going to be likely or a good thing to have this force in country, because obviously it would fall apart as soon as the Russians would test the resolve of Europeans to actually take casualties, for example. And whether there's a will to actually resist Russian military aggression remains to be seen. And I think that's obviously something that we would need to have a strong agreement beforehand in terms of rules of engagement. What would happen if the Russians would try anything? But I think at this stage it's fairly hypothetical, because I don't see the Russians really going for it. I don't really see the Europeans being ready for it. And last point is, you would need some US support, whether it's when it comes to certain ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities. There's certain capabilities that European militaries just don't have, like certain surface-to-surface precision strike capabilities, for example, logistical support, maybe even support in planning. And then we haven't really talked about other enabling capabilities like long-range air defense and so forth. I mean, it's a tall order. I do think it would be doable. But again, as I said,
without the U.S. providing all those things, those seem pretty important.
No, they are obviously important, but I think if you look at like deploy anything from like 3 to 5 brigades, I think the Europeans could at least do for 18 to 24 months, and there could actually be decent air cover for these units, and I think you could pull it off. But I think my main point is, if you have the political will And if you see this really as not a whole of nation effort, but a whole of European government effort, where you really are willing to put substantial resources into and are actually willing to risk the lives of European soldiers, which is not something easily done and should also not be carelessly done.
Of course. Gustav.
Yeah, I think we need to separate the ideas what we are talking about, because they have different political implications. So the first is a UN or OSCE mandated force. I don't think that has any value, because usually these observer or peacekeeping missions, they rest, or their deterrent value rests on the assumption that the possible attacking party doesn't want to be the aggressor in front of the world stage. That was the case with the OSCE SMM in Donbass. The Russians still tried to convince the world that these are local miners and tractor drivers, and they had nothing to do with all the T-72s driving around in Donetsk, etc. That's why they engaged with it. And I think the Russians are past that stage. They don't give a shit, to say this bluntly. And we can draw parallels from countries that also don't give anything about their prestige on the international stage. Look at how Israel respects UNIFIL in Lebanon, and there's a sizable French contingent there. So you're not, messing with just developing world countries. You're messing with a P5 member, a small one, but still. And Netanyahu, UNIFIL is like, yeah, okay, try to pass around them, and if not, shoot them. That's roughly how he treats them. The second thing is a European peacekeeping force. And by peacekeeping, they imply that Europe can guarantee the integrity of the zero line or border or whatever you would call it. But that would consume much too many troops, and the Europeans don't have that. So that would be something that the Russians would immediately test, because they know the force strength isn't there. The third thing would be, and that's what Franz alluded to, is a kind of more enhanced forward present type of force. So you deploy brigades to Ukraine, they rotate, they become part of a Ukrainian corps or whatever the then leadership operational structure of the Ukrainian armed forces is. They participate in maneuvers, they train, and they have occasional deployments to the zero line. And if the Russians attack, they never know, will you shoot a German or a Ukrainian? And so in theory, if they retry the war, they would immediately, by attacking German, British, French forces, start a war with at least European part of NATO. But here comes the trick. This would be seconded by a tremendous amount, if the Russians restart, this would be seconded by a tremendous amount of Russian nuclear threats. And then the tricky question is, do we really, with basically 2 submarines in the Atlantic, go into a game of nuclear brinkmanship with the Russians to call the bluff, or will they call ours? And that's basically where really all the other things, yeah, it costs money and it's hard, but it's still doable. But this nuclear game without the US is something that is suboptimal, to be polite. And that's why exactly the French and the British, because they understand actually this mechanism, try to have at least this kind of reassurance in Washington. But the problem is, first of all, will they get them? Second of all, even if they get it on paper, is it credible with the current administration? I mean, look at what they're doing. And that leads me to my conclusion of all this debate. I think the Russians are happy with that, because it is delaying other decisions on long-term support and industrial measures to provide the lethal goods that Ukraine urgently needs. And it's 2 steps ahead. I don't see the Trump administration producing any kind of ceasefire that is worth the paper written on. And without that, we are still in a basically war mode. And that war mode calls for other things than pondering about peacekeepers.
All really good points. It's such a thorny and difficult issue. But I actually want to come back to this question about how long Ukraine can hold on. I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but my question is, do you think that if Ukraine keeps fighting with the backing of the Europeans, and I saw that the UK and I think Norway had committed more military aid to Ukraine just today. So assuming that Europe continues to provide some influx of the things that Ukraine needs, at least to some extent, Ukraine has its own domestic drone capacity, which I really enjoyed. I think it was, I can't remember who just produced the report, but was showing just what a high percentage of casualties the drones are inflicting on Russian forces. So there's lots of pieces there. But I guess my question would be, could Ukraine find itself in a better position later? Or is it just a story of like slow decline and eventually Ukraine would find itself in an even worse position? So yes, they could keep fighting. Yes, nothing collapses eminently, but it's really a story of slow deterioration. And this goes on for another 12 to 18 months. And Europe has poured more resources in. Ukraine has committed more lives, and they're only in a worse position.
Postponing the inevitable at a high, high cost.
To my point of view, that is a possibility. It's not inevitable. Much depends on how Russia will cope with its losses and its economy over the next year, because we see that on the Ukrainian side, a lot of things get tricky and hard. But the problem is, in a war of attrition, both parties degrade. And the issue is who degrades faster. Here, of course, the big issue on what is holding the Russian down is US sanctions. There are US sanctions, US energy sanctions, and the secondary sanctions, which is why other countries try to disguise their business with Russia the utmost. And that's something that is really up to Washington. Discussing secondary sanctions in EU context, I mean, to be honest, American sanctions have protected the integrity of European sanctions, because we at certain times we can declare sanctions, but our policing of our own sanctions is suboptimal, to be polite. And the risk of running into repercussions on the American market is what actually keeps sanctions discipline in Europe. So that is something, a capability that Europe needs to kind of build up immediately. And here, of course, the lawyer's advice on how to bypass Orban on that is good and expensive, but that's going to be a really tricky thing.
Yeah, Franz, what do you think?
It's very hard to look too many months ahead in this conflict, and it's never just about material factors, of course, in a military confrontation or even in a war of attrition at the end of the day, right? But I think Ukraine could potentially be in a worse position based on these material factors in a couple of months from now. Right now, as I said, I don't really see Ukraine morale substantially taking a hit, but this could happen. There's also, though, the prospect of coming under Russian rule, right? That could energize the Ukrainians even further, and there could also be the possibility, frankly, if the country really feels abandoned. So maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think it's extremely hard to predict what's going to happen in the next couple of months. Right now, I can say that I don't see an imminent collapse of the front line. I see that the Ukrainian system at the front line is working, and there is the possibility that the Russians also make substantial tactical mistakes, that the Russians suffer tremendous casualties, that also Russia grows tired of this war at some point, right? But the way it looks at the moment, and that's, I think, the major problem, that Ukraine, based on current trends, is most likely to hit rock bottom, so to speak, sooner than Russia. Mm-hmm. And I think US military assistance could have actually prolonged that, or at least could have tried to even the odds who of the two would hit rock bottom, so to speak, first. And I do think, and maybe that's the most tragic of all these events that have been, or like perhaps that's the most tragic consequence of all of what's been unfolding at the political strategic level, is that if Ukraine fixes its manpower issue, if Ukraine fixes a couple of other structural deficiencies in its armed forces, if Ukraine does a couple of more things, I do think that, generally speaking, in cooperation with the West, with the United States, with the European and other allies and partners in the world, Ukraine actually had a pretty good system in place to convince the Russians that sooner or later, perhaps, it would be wise to enter negotiations.
Yeah,
And
I think that's the biggest tragedy. I mean, Zelensky keeps saying you have to impose costs so that Putin recognizes he can't do this forever, and then you get a more genuine conversation. But now that seems
That's
really
over.
out the window. They're being brought, it's going to be back in the G8. We're voting with them in the UN Security Council, voting against a resolution calling on Russia to remove its forces from Ukraine. I mean, don't even get Jim and I started, because we do this every single day. We send each other all of the horrible things that are happening. But I totally agree with you, Franz. I mean, it is the United States that has been the key variable, and it seems like it has been. I mean, I think we're heading towards a really nasty end to this whole war.
Could I ask a quick question just to jump in? So there's going to be a summit meeting in June in The Hague. It's a NATO summit meeting. What do you think is going to happen there? I don't know if you all are NATO nicks or not, but what do you think is going to happen at this NATO mission, at this NATO summit, where you're going to have a communique where Poles and the Balts, the Nordics, others who are hardliners, are going to have language that's really tough, and a really rallying call to the rest of the allies to spend 5%. You're going to have this, and then you're going to have the United States on the other hand in there, probably trying to dilute the language. I guess we'll ask for 5%, but if we feel Russia is not the threat that we thought it was, they're our friend now. Maybe we don't need 5%. I mean, what do you think is going to happen in The Hague at that NATO summit when you've got the United States coming in there with its new trajectory and the allies coming in another trajectory? What's going to happen, Gustav?
Well, I think Trump would be happy if the 5% were spent on his own golf courses. But in all seriousness, I think they will tussle, they will fight. I don't know if there will be a communique. I think there won't. You just see on current votes, they just. So what I know from Europeans is they start to think about, for example, what if the Americans withdraw officers? How are the purges that Elon Musk is organizing in the US going to affect the proficiency of the US Army, the intelligence services? How to replace that? How to circumvent that, etc. There are a lot of all of these scenarios are horrible, to be honest. But there is now a lot of planning in that direction. And I think that summit will give Europeans clarity which of these horrible scenarios will come true.
So for a final question, I mean, this is something that I think is really bothering and really concerning me, which is, you have more and more analysis out there, which I tend to agree with, that talks about the United States now is going to subscribe to the spheres of influence kind of world, and where might makes right. And we all, will carve up the world into these 3 spheres of influence. The US does Western Hemisphere, Russia as the biggest nuclear state will kind of have its way in its quote unquote near abroad and in Europe, and China will have the Indo-Pacific. From Russia's perspective, from Europe's perspective, what will that look like in practice? I mean, it seems to me that this administration is making an assumption that if Russia has its way with Ukraine, or at least is able to achieve its major objectives in Ukraine, that it's going to sit back and be satisfied. And I wonder what you all think about that. Like what in a world where we say, okay, Russia, sphere of influence, over to you all. Like, what does that look like? What are you concerned that Russia could do, would do, will do?
Well, I think what I said previously certainly is a possibility, right? That you could potentially see a reordering of the European security architecture really based on great power politics that you've seen in the 19th century, essentially like a version of what the French Empire and the Russian Empire negotiated in, I forgot the exact date now, but I believe it was in 1807, the so-called Tilsit agreement, which was really to the detriment of Austria and Prussia and all the other smaller states, similar to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, right, in a way where you have these spheres of influence, and really, it's really about trying to essentially, essentially try to achieve what Russia always wanted to achieve, essentially get the Americans out of Europe, substantially weaken or destroy NATO, weaken or degrade in importance the European Union, and really primarily talk again to other capitals that Russia perceives to be like great powers. And I think that's a possibility. And again, it hinges on a couple of European capitals, in my opinion, saying no and being a bit bolder than they were over the last couple of decades when it comes to their defense policy, security policies, right? But
so if we do Russia's work for them and we say, all right, we're out of Europe, are you worried that Russia goes into Moldova, that it starts to look at the Baltics a different way? Like, it almost gets back to this fundamental question, which was, for Russia, was it about Ukraine, or is it about more than Ukraine? Is it satisfied with controlling and subjugating Ukraine, or will it look for opportunities to restore the previous role that it once had, including, over parts of the former Soviet Union? I guess that's what it comes down to. And so for people living in those countries, if the United States has washed its hands and said we're out of Europe, then are we looking at a world? Do you think that Russia would militarily try to take additional territory beyond Ukraine?
Well, unfortunately for our listeners, they can't see what I'm holding into the camera because I have one of the originals of Carl Schmitt, Völkerrechtliche Großraumordnung und das Interventionsverbot raumfremder Mächte, as it's called in German. And that is Carl Schmitt's essay from 1939, where he basically gave the legal rationale to what would later become the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a international law based on sphere of influences. And if you subtract, if you replace the United Kingdom by the United States and replace Poland by Ukraine, you arrive at an average Putin speech. But there is another thing inside, because I have a vast literature of smut stuff, Reich und Raum, and that is from 1940, after the successful operations by both the Soviet Union and Germany. This is in the Second World War, where Carl Schmitt talks of a new era, a new system of international law that has replaced the old liberal universalism under the League of Nations, that has successfully established the sphere of influence policies, and how this will be the future of humankind. Because they were very, very, very confident that this order was stable from 1940. Of course, we knew that after 1940 there came 1941. And I think the new Trump order will just go down the same way as Carl Schmitt's order, or the the Molotov-Ribbentrop order, it's not going to be stable. Of course, the Russians will test. Of course, the Russians will see Europe as a bounty. Recall Yeltsin, just give me Europe. The problem is the Poles, Estonians, the Finns, they will resist. Of course, there will be war. The Russians will probably try to make this war as brutal as they can to kind of dissuade others from also picking up resistance. But at the end, these kind of great power arrangements aren't stable. And the Russians are very likely to overestimate themselves and to be super cocky and unrealistic in what they're getting into. So my guess would, that's probably there's a fair likelihood this will happen. And there is a almost certainty that this will just end into a big war. And how that war ends will depend on whether the US system will see another free and fair election and how that will end. But that's not in my pay grade.
This might be the darkest, most dismal way we've ever ended, Jim.
I know. But I think it's pretty.
I agree, and that's why it's so upsetting.
It's realistic.
Yeah,
we've seen.
Well, I mean, there's always the possibility, though.
Give us some light. Give us some hope, Franz.
Well, it just, maybe perhaps let's end it on something that Winston Churchill never really said, but you can always trust the Americans to do the right thing after they exhausted all other options. I'm not saying that we should cling to that hope, but I do think there is a possibility that given how capricious the current government of the United States is in its conducting of international relations, and the fact that there does not seem to be a general grand plan behind a lot of what's happening, perhaps there's a possibility also that the Trump administration can still be convinced at some point down the road to contribute more to a more stable international order, right? Particularly if there's any hint of it undermining the economic agenda of the Trump administration, right? But maybe that's as positive as it can be today.
It's not. It is a positive note, and I guess the one thing in the American media today is more news of town halls and other things that U.S. congressmen and senators are holding, where Americans are kind of pushing back, and seeing some interviews on TV. And I know it's probably not a widely held view, but of Americans reacting to Putin calling Zelensky a dictator and saying that's not what I voted for. And so, they're just little anecdotes and teeny glimmers, but in an effort to try to end on a more positive note, Franz, I think that was an excellent, and you saved us, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for appearing with us as well on the show.
Yeah, great discussion. Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.